Welcome back to Zilog and Moto. I hope you're having a good day. So, as promised in the last video, we're going to be talking about a game that you've probably heard of, and that's more interesting than virtual fishing. And that game is Paperboy, specifically for the Master System. There's also a Genesis version that I actually saw for the first time last weekend in a store, but unfortunately that copy had some really awful sun damage, so I left it. But for now, we'll be talking about the 8-bit original. Paperboy was originally an arcade game released in 1985 by Atari. Using a similar control scheme to their popular series of Star Wars machines by way of a yoke controller to simulate a bike riding experience, Paperboy puts you in the shoes of the titular, Paperboy, as you attempt to deliver a week's worth of newspapers to your local neighborhood. Or at least I'm assuming it's his neighborhood, with as nuts as it is. I can't imagine he'd ride across town to deliver newspapers there. Or maybe the pay's just that good. Anyway, let's just move on. Now, the younger viewers of this video may be wondering basic questions like, why is someone delivering newspapers on a bike? Or, what's a newspaper? Or, who's Atari? And multiple other things that make me wonder why I'm not collecting Social Security yet. Just go with this idea. It used to be a thing that kids would have a job delivering newspapers to people's houses in the mornings. Until people finally realized that, hey, maybe it would be better to have adults handle this sort of thing and not have kids going around a bunch of strangers every day, potentially asking for money for unpaid subscribers. For whatever reason, I'm guessing due to its simplicity, Paperboy became a huge hit and was released on everything, seeing conversions to all the various 8 and 16-bit home computers, portable consoles, with the Atari Lynx version being especially noteworthy at the time, and then also for the NES as a Christmas title in 1988, and one of the last United States Master System releases in 1990, as you see here. Paperboy also has a direct sequel that we'll talk about in a later video, and has appeared in various remasters and re-releases over the years. The Paperboy itself has also appeared in video game-themed movies like Pixels and Wreck-It Ralph, so it's safe to say that 35 years later, the game has definitely left its mark on the annals of video game lore. Now, having said all that, you'd think this is some amazing, groundbreaking, stone-cold classic, right? Well, about that. Sometimes things that are memorable aren't memorable because they're good. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Let's take a closer look. And here's Paperboy. Those of you that have seen past videos I've done on Master System games will immediately notice a difference in the cover in that it doesn't flat out suck. Also, notice at the top the new Master System logo. This was introduced with the 1990 cartridges in the Master System 2 re-release, as Sega had finally wisened up after the release of the Genesis and figured out that they needed their games to stand out a bit more. You can also tell at the bottom of the case, in the corner, that this was a late release, as it states it's playable on the original Master System, the Master System 2, and the Genesis with a power-based converter, and that's how I'm playing it. One more quick note about this. Most Master System titles I've either found locally or online, but this one actually came from a pretty great retro game store in Orlando called Royal Empire Gaming. So if you're in the area, definitely check them out. I was in town for a visit to Disney, and we took a rainy day off to go visit other things in the area, and this was by far the best retro store I visited. They had tons of stuff, and I probably walked out of there with about 20 items. If you're collecting, it always pays to visit stores and areas you travel to, because you never know what you're going to find, even if you already live in a pretty big city. Back to the game. By 1989, Sega had figured out their covers weren't doing them any favors, and started trying to give the Master System games more flair, like white versions of Genesis titles, essentially. And you can really see that here, with the normal bold block font at the top, and a full color cover that extends through the spine and onto the back. The case itself is in good shape, with the hang tab being intact at the top. Although there is a bit of scratching here and there if you look closely at the finish on the back. And if you look closely, you can tell the inner cover, I'm not sure if you can tell from this shot or not, there is a little wrinkling here due to a little bit of water damage, but it does seem like it was, dried out pretty well, so it's not too bad. Back on, let's see, on the back here, you see how they finally started to get creative with the layout. With the old Master System titles, usually you had 2 block screenshots, and then just a paragraph down here at the bottom, with a fairly poor description of the game, actually. And now, instead, we've got 3 actually pretty nice screenshots for the game instead of just 2, and I would say a little bit better description here. They did keep the old rounds and players and peripherals, block and all that, but it's no longer in a box like it used to be. Finally, if you look real close to the bottom, this is actually technically a third-party title. Not sure if you're going to be able to see this here, but in very small letters it says Paperboy Atari Games Corporation, licensed to Tengen Incorporated. So it doesn't look like, say, Rampage with a totally, wildly different cover. It still looks like a Master System game, and I guess that just must be part of the agreement that Tengen had with Sega to produce this. Opening the case up, cartridge in, it's in decent shape. Again, there's a little bit of scratching and stuff on it, but the label's all intact, and the name's all in capitals too, which I found a little weird. But anyway, and then the manual is, a tiny bit bent up and stuff, but it's intact. However, if you look at it, it's only 2 pages stapled together. It's really tiny. I can't say anything really bad about it though, because there's just not a whole lot about Paperboy that really needs to be explained. I mean, in this 8 pages here, this really does kind of explain everything you need to know about the game. I just kind of find it funny that I'm going to have to buy Double Dragon 3 for Genesis for the 3rd time, due to the last manual I got missing the center page, and if this manual was missing the center page, it'd be missing everything. Anyway, alright, that's a pretty thorough look at the outside. Let's check the game out itself and see how it looks. Since this is a review of an early to mid-80s arcade title, there's not going to be a whole lot for me to say here because the game simply is fairly shallow, as were most arcade titles at the time. Now, I know I said something similar to kick off the review of the last game, since it was just a bass fishing title, and then ended up going for 20 minutes on it, but I mean it this time. I really just don't know how much blood I can get out of this stone. But when you try to evaluate how good or not good this game is, you have to keep that in mind, or else it's very easy just to write this off as a 1-star game and throw it back on the shelf. And that's not really fair to the original game or this port. Before I go too much further, like for Rampage, I did a bit of research on the various ports of this game to try to figure out how well the Master System version did as a port compared to everything else in the market. And the short answer is, it did pretty damn well. In the ports I examined, I think I'd have to rate the Genesis port the best, followed by the Amiga and the Atari ST, which is pretty normal as all are 16-bit machines. From an 8-bit standpoint, the Master System came out as the clear leader. As was the case with Rampage, the NES version looks like ass compared to the Master System, much less the arcade. In fact, the NES version is so bad that even the Commodore 64 version, with its blocky and ultra-low-res presentation, gives the NES version a run for its money. And I dare say the Commodore 64 version has better music. Now, I understand, like Rampage, the NES version came out before the Master System one did, but come on, at that point, the original arcade game had been out for over 3 years. It was a sloppy port, plain and simple, and if you want to hear more ranting about it, James, Angry Video Game Nerd, Rolf, has an entire video about it you can check out for more. He does it far more justice than I ever could. Fun fact, the ending music to all Pat the NES Punk is from the NES Paperboy soundtrack. I did not know that until doing this review. So now that we've gotten the question of whether it's a good port out of the way compared to its contemporaries, let's tackle the game itself. Paperboy itself is kind of hard to describe from a genre perspective, but if I had to say anything, I'd liken it most to an isometric shooter like Zaxxon. Now, before you think I'm off my rocker, which I probably am, but that's not really germane to this conversation, think about it for a minute. Paperboy has you riding down a street of houses at an approximately 45-degree angle, pointed to the upper right of the screen, and as you ride the bike, your character can change elevation up and down due to either jumping over a ramp or riding down into the street, with the sidewalk acting as the medium between the two. Your character is constantly moving from the beginning of the street to the end of the street, and you can control the speed of that forward movement, and move left and right to avoid objects, which will kill you if you get hit. And finally, as you're riding your bike down the street, you are attempting to throw newspapers to hit targets at the various houses in an effort to score points and move on to the next level depending on your accuracy. That all sure sounds like an isometric shooter to me. Genre definition aside, the previous paragraph pretty much describes how the game plays. To be clear, Paperboy is an arcade title with the main goal being to score as many points as possible in an effort to enter your name on the high score screen. At the beginning of the game, you have three choices. You can either take the paper route on Easy Street, Middle of the Road, or Hard Way. And as the names indicate, the difficulty is raised depending on the route you choose. But scoring also increases to match. Regardless of the difficulty of the path you choose, your goal is to deliver papers to all the houses on the street with their subscribers by throwing the newspapers onto either their porch or their mailbox, while avoiding cars, construction men, and even the Grim Reaper. Make it to the end of your route, and you'll enter a stunt zone to earn even more points without a chance of death. After finishing the stunt zone, either by running out of time or getting to the end, your route will be analyzed, and any houses you missed will become non-subscribers. And if you manage to deliver all of your paper, you will turn non-subscribing houses into subscribers, giving you more targets the next day, with the eventual goal to complete 7 days on the job. While I think the concept behind the game is original, the execution's a bit off. My main problem is simply that it's difficult and repetitive. You're only given 3 lives at the start of the week to try to make it down to the end, and there's no ability for you to earn more lives if you die for some reason. Even riding down Easy Street can be tough, and all the routes get tougher every day with more enemies added to the screen each day that passes. Okay, so that's what the game is and what it consists of, but is it any good? This is where things get tough, as not only is this a port, but it's a port of a game from 34 years ago at the time of this video, and it's a late port, not coming out until 1990, when Sega was all but shoveling dirt on the Master System in the United States. The graphics in the game are not stellar, but they're close to the original title and are relatively colorful. At the same time, we're still talking about a game from 1985. The graphics are only going to be so good with that as a source. Also, as is somewhat common with Master System titles, there's some slowdown when too many enemies/obstacles show up on screen at once. With as precise as you need to be to not die in this game, slow down at an inopportune time can mean a quick and annoying death. Also, there's very little variation in the graphics, with most houses, including non-subscribing houses, looking very similar and having their layouts reused from time to time in the level. In the original arcade title, and the lesser extent the NES version, non-subscriber houses would be spooky and gothic, whereas in the Master System version, they're simply palette swapped to be black. As mediocre as the graphics are in the game, the sound is absolutely atrocious. There's one background music track, and it plays over and over and over again. While it sounds similar to the music from the arcade version in that you can recognize the tune, it's a poor rendition of it, and a very short-length sample that gets repeated. Along with the poor music, the sound effects in the game are minimal at best. You get a crash when you wreck your bike, a crash when you break a window, and a chime when you properly deliver a newspaper. That's it. I'm not sure if only 3 sound effects in an entire game is a record, but it's gotta be close to it. The gameplay is probably the best of the basic aspects of the game. While the gameplay in Paperboy isn't exactly complex, it could still have been easily screwed up, making an already difficult game even worse, but thankfully the controls are kept tight and responsive. I never once died because I felt like the computer cheated. It was always because I misjudged an enemy coming at me and mistimed it, or because I took a poor path through someone's front yard and ended up blocking myself into a rock and a hard place. In James' video about the NES version, he made many complaints about not being able to get the timing down of throwing the papers and hitting the targets. Now granted, that's the NES version, which I'm sure probably does have timing issues, but in the Master System version, I was able to hit targets pretty easily, and usually when I missed a target, it was because I waited too long and just overshot it. This would usually elicit an annoyed groan from me, but I also recognize that this was a fault of mine and not the game having inaccurate controls. Finally, let's face facts.
Paperboy is a 1 megabit title on an 8-bit system when most 8-bit systems were either 2 or 4 megabits. Now, size isn't everything, especially when it comes to games, but in this case, it does indicate an issue. Had Paperboy been released in 1986 as a system launch title, or even a year later in 1987, I think we're probably talking about a wholly acceptable release, and it's possibly in the 3-star range. But it wasn't, and no matter how good the arcade port is, it's somewhat difficult to care about a 5-year-old arcade title. At that point, you'd be attempting to release something that's better than the original title, and not merely attempting to recreate it. Due to the game's mediocre graphics, abysmal sound, awkward control, and sheer difficulty, I can't give Paperboy any more than 2 out of 5. And at that point, 1 of the stars is simply because it's a pretty accurate port, and far better than the NES version. Paperboy on the Master System is a textbook example of too little, too late.
Okay, that was Paperboy. I thought it was a good idea to do a video this week of a game that actually had some more name recognition after last week's fishing debacle. And that's why I went after this deliverer of dead trees here. I must admit that even though I only gave this game 2 stars, I did have a mild bit of amusement for playing the game for the first time in forever. And I thought it was especially cool to look at a rare, in the United States, Master System title. Tune in next week when I change things up a bit and get back to the Sega CD. What title? Well, I haven't decided yet. But I did manage to get 4 new ones last week, so I've got some more options. Remember, whatever you play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.